in the United Kingdom, deregulation initiatives and privatisation have clearly had a radical impact on port operation. David Whitehead became director of the British Ports Association in 1993, and since that time has had a major hand in British and European community policy development on this particular front. Will you now welcome a warm Western Australian welcome to David Whitehead. Thank you.
Just lower these first. Thank you, Chairman. Well, thank you very much, Jeff, for that introduction. And first of all, let me just say this is my first ever visit to Australia, and I would like to thank Steve and his team for all the kindness and hospitality they've shown me so far. It has been quite fantastic. I'd like to thank Paul as well, and Brad in particular, because Brad took me up to Dampier on Monday, I think it was Monday evening, and he said to me, "You're about to go to one of the hottest and driest parts of Australia." So I thought, well, I won't take an umbrella. I was there for 24 hours. It stopped raining when we came back yesterday morning. I felt very much at home. But yes, fantastic, and a great opportunity to see that. Quite an unusual port in many ways. So I'm learning a lot, and I wanted really today to talk about three things quite quickly. First of all, say something about the UK ports market, and especially the relationship we have with the European ports market, which is where we do most of our trading. Secondly, say something about the way in which ports are structured in the UK. I think it may be relevant to some of the things you're doing. Effectively, how we got to where we are in the UK. And finally, draw a few conclusions. So I can give you the benefit of my wisdom on what makes a successful ports industry. You didn't realise when you came into the room today you'd find the answer to everything. Well, you'll soon find out. Before I do that, just to say that, as Jeff said, I've been involved in the ports industry for over 20 years in total. I was first Director of Policy of the British Ports Federation, as it then was, but I've always worked in the private sector. I worked in printing, publishing companies, and in the fruit industry for some years. And in fact, one of my first roles was as a management trainee for Fife's Group, which brings a lot of bananas into the UK and other fruit. And as a management trainee, they send you pretty well everywhere. My first experience of the ports industry, they said, "We want you to go down to Southampton to check the quality of the bananas, because somebody has to do it." So that was my first experience of being on a working quay, first experience of seeing dockers. Someone's already been a bit rude about dockers, but I did see them, and they're easy to see because they never moved. And there was, in those days, this was 1979, I hasten to add, a long time ago, there was a line of men handing boxes of bananas one to the other, looking very solemn as they did so. And quite frankly, every cliche you've ever heard about bad labour relations was encapsulated on that quay at that particular time. And it really was an example of terrible collusion between management and unions to get it all wrong. And as an example of how wrong it did go, Fifes used to bring those bananas into Southampton. Eventually they gave up because they couldn't get them off the ship quickly enough. So they decided in the end to send all the bananas over to Rotterdam, where they could offload them more quickly, put them onto a ro-ro vessel and bring them over to Dover and into the country in that way. And that's a pretty poor reflection on a piece of efficiency. But I'll come back to that in a minute. First of all, and perhaps, which one is on there? Tonnage? Ah, right. These are the only figures I will actually give you today, and this is just one measure of relative ports industries, a fairly crude measure, and there are lots of others, but you can see by this you're doing pretty well. You've won this battle, but that is a staggering figure. And I was staggered at the volumes. You're doing 1 billion tonnes or so in Australia. That is an incredible figure that you're getting through. The population of the EU is 500 million. Population of Australia, what, about 23 million? You've got a bigger land mass as well. So we've got the population, you've got the space and the resources. Quite simple facts, but never ignore the simple basics, because these drive ports industries in different ways. I'm not completely obsessed with bananas. But I just wanted to say a little bit about how the European trade is constructed, and again, I hope in a fairly simple way. This is a thing called the blue banana, and it's a concept, not a particularly complicated one, but a concept invented by some French geographers. And the blue banana covers the areas of highest population and industrial production throughout the EU. So it stretches from the northern UK down to northern Italy. And the basic rule of thumb here is that the size of any ports or any EU member state's port industry is largely a function of proximity to the blue banana. So that space covers the three largest ports industries in the EU, which are the UK, Italy, and the Netherlands. So if anyone tells you that Finland is the next big thing on the scene in the ports industry, is there anyone from Finland here? No, well, I'm safe. Finland will never have a large ports industry. It's too peripheral, it's too small, and it will never be a significant magnet for trade. And just a bit about population. The London commuter belt is the largest urban area in Europe. There are 13.5 million people there in a very small area. So you can appreciate that explains the draw that exerts on trade in general. Just two other quick points about European Union trade. The northern countries handle double what the south handles, and that's a source of great frustration for the southern countries, for the Mediterranean countries in particular. The various reasons for this: the north is basically a bigger market, but restrictive practices are also to blame, and the south is a little bit better on restrictive practices than the north. The north is better at hiding them. They're not absent, but there are issues there with dock labour and with other bits of need for deregulation. It's also about ease of access. Never ignore maps, never ignore geography when you're talking about ports. What is often forgotten is that Italy and Spain are bounded by very big mountain ranges. It just takes a lot more to get stuff from there up to other markets. It's just more complex. But it really does annoy Italy when they see containers offloaded in Rotterdam, which are coming into the Italian market, a source of great frustration. And it does influence EU ports politics. Another factor to bear in mind, and I stress this particularly about Europe, is the largely unchanging pattern of trade. I know we always talk about change, the pace of change. Some things don't, quite frankly, change all that much. And the dominant ports now in the EU were dominant 50 years ago and probably 50 years before that. Of course, there have been a few exceptions. Containers, of course, have been a new dynamic in the market. Oil business is a new dynamic. And the EU centre of gravity has drifted a little bit further east with the accession of some of the Central European countries. But the actual effect of that has been to consolidate the position of ports such as Rotterdam, Antwerp, Hamburg, the big three there, because they are really the magnet for trade, and their hinterland is enormous. The effect of the accession of new countries is in fact to make the UK a little bit more peripheral. We're a little bit further away now from the markets. And just on markets generally and change, a few remarks about globalisation. UK trade is dominated by trade with the rest of the EU, and for example, the UK imports 3 times more from the EU than we do from the US and China combined, and we export more to Ireland than we do to China, which puts globalisation into a bit of a perspective. I know it's a huge force, but we're only doing now what we did hundreds of years ago when Europeans went over to the Far East to pick up spices. We're now picking up iPhones. The process is there, it's just bigger, but we've kind of turned it into something, a totally new phenomenon, which quite frankly it isn't really. And the economic reality is that rich countries tend to trade most with other rich countries that are near to them. So the USA's biggest trading partner is Canada, not China, and the third biggest trading partner with the USA is Mexico. Next, just a few words about European ports policy, which will be very quick because there isn't much of it. The EU Commission has been really pretty content to let ports develop in their own way, but they are suspicious of them, and suspicious in two particular areas. The first is the way in which service contracts are awarded, particularly big container contracts. The other is about financial transparency and the way in which public money, especially, is recorded in accounts and where the audit trail is. Port subsidy, which doesn't exist in the UK, is generally a hot political topic in Europe. We're just, in fact, about to see a new draft regulation launched by the Commission, which is an attempt to ensure that there's sufficient choice for users of service providers, and then there is a clear audit trail for public money. But subsidy is complicated. If it comes to you, it's the best investment ever. If it goes to somebody else, it's an atrocious waste of resources. So how do you deal with that? But for continental ports, it is no secret that there is a strong public element, and this affects both funding and strategy. The direction of travel amongst the largest continental ports, Rotterdam and the others, is towards a more market-based approach with less day-to-day involvement from the cities which own them. Sounds a bit like, as the Minister was saying here. And ports on the continent, again in contrast to the UK, are certainly regarded as public assets, ultimately accountable to the public rather than to owners or to shareholders. And also continental ports have an extremely strict division between port authority functions and service provision. So cargo handlers are quite separate from port authority and private sector. Port authority is generally public, cargo handling is private sector. But this public-private sector combination is very significant. To have a public port authority firmly linked into government policymakers, aligned with private sector cargo handlers, is a pretty powerful combination. Next, a little more detail on UK ports. And a few words on the way in which trade is distributed. This shows distribution of container traffic. Each box is 1 million TEUs, each symbol. I mentioned the London commuter belt, high consumer demand, which drives our traffic, and this reflects that heavy concentration in the southeast corner. Containers are about 10% of our total throughput. And next, if you keep that one in your mind, the next is ro-ro traffic. I think you can see there's a pattern emerging here. Again, heavy concentration in the southeast. Also show a little bit the importance of our links to Ireland as well over in the west, and also, and particularly between Scotland and Ireland. But these patterns are not just about centres of demand, it's also to do with ships. The problem with ships is they don't really want to go anywhere. It just costs too much money. So they take the easiest route, which is the shortest. So a lot of cargo for distribution around the UK starts in the southeast and is then trucked up, which is not the most environmentally friendly way of doing things. Occasionally someone says, well, you know, we should get new routes up to the north of England. We're not moving the traffic in the best possible way, but this never quite takes off. Never commercially successful. But as you go further north through the UK, the port traffic converts more into bulk cargo and other industries such as fishing, leisure, and particularly offshore energy, which is a huge growth sector for the UK. The UK is the largest ports industry in Europe, and that's really a combination of the fact we've got, as I said, a big population. We have a large economy. It's a bit struggling at the moment, but it's still large. A lot of oil, and we're an island. If you put all those things together, you inevitably have a big ports industry. But it does mean that ports are absolutely fundamental to the UK economy, not just as trade gateways, but as providers of jobs and growth. So that's a little bit about the market. The next, a bit about how we organise ourselves. And this picture was actually taken the year I was born, so you'll just have to guess. No evident safety regime here, or security regime, or much mechanisation. These are barrels of wine being imported into the London docks. The greatest interest is shown by that customs man who's looking at how much he can get in terms of excise duty. But the process we've gone through since this picture was taken, apart of course from all the technical changes, are some very significant political changes in the form of deregulation. And we've had two major pieces of deregulation over the past 30 years. And the first was reform of pilotage, and this took place in 1987. And this reform was a fairly modest one, but it was a little bit testing the water before some of the bigger reforms came through, just to see what the reaction would be. This was in the latter days of Mrs. Thatcher's government. Up until 1987, the pilots had been largely employed by the government. But the change was that there was a conversion from government employment to direct port employment. So the pilots came under the thumb of the ports themselves, and it really regularised their employment, brought them into the management schemes properly, brought them into the ports properly. So no special conditions were attached to being a pilot. Having said that, pilots still represent a formidable political group in the UK, but in terms of their management, we think we've got it just about right, and we have a good regime for PECs, pilotage exemption certificates, which is always a little bit of a barometer of how successful pilotage is working as a system. So a successful change we had there. The next was a much more controversial change, and this was the reform of dock labour. My first experience was 1979, while the reform went through in 1989, and that was the repeal of the dock labour scheme. And this ended the special conditions that dockers enjoyed, jobs for life, etc. I'm sure you'll be familiar with some of the stories. And it meant, again, as with pilots, that ports, as a result of the change, could employ dockers under what you might describe as normal terms and conditions. And there was considerable nervousness about this change, about the potential for strikes and disruption, none of which actually materialised. And one of the reasons for that is that there were some very generous severance packages to dockers. Some of them got £30,000. Well, you could buy a house for that, certainly, in 1989. So sometimes throwing money at a problem really does help. I think also the dockers knew that there were going to be changes. Obviously, containerisation was in full swing by then. But that was a significant change. The third reform was privatisation, which is probably the thing that the UK is best known for in terms of its ports. Privatisation, in fact, was not started by the government. It was actually started by Glasgow, Clyde who were a trust port and tried to move a private bill to privatise themselves. The government saw that and thought, well, that sounds quite a good idea. We'll convert that into a public bill. So they did that, and it became the Ports Act in 1991. I think there might be some misunderstandings really about the bill and the process of privatisation. For example, I think we should point out, first of all, the government never owned the ports in the first place, so the change wasn't that radical, quite frankly. They already had a huge degree of financial and strategic autonomy. Nor did the legislation convert every port into a company with owners. What it did was allow ports to take the opportunity to privatise. And some did, and some didn't. But a strong driver was also on unlocking property values. A lot of them were sitting on very extensive property. Property, of course, in the UK, as everywhere else, has a high value, so that was regarded as a big opportunity. All those that privatised in the early 90s now have different owners. The usual pattern is you get a management buyout, hang on for 2 years, sell it, off you go. And the ports then become usually parts of bigger groups. Another thing that is interesting about the process is that they all started as publicly quoted companies on the stock exchange in the early 90s. All are now privately owned companies. And that is a significant change because it shows that ports do best with a long-term view, and the stock market is not always the best to provide such a long-term view. Especially ports are capital-intensive, long-term investments. So in fact, a big feature of port ownership in the UK at the moment is pension funds. But they're all private companies now. You can't buy shares in them. And a couple more factors in relation to privatisation. It has been quite polarising in the UK. It has been mixed. There are strong supporters who will convince you it's the only way. There are strong detractors who will convince you never to go there. There's also some resentment, there's a whole list of issues. There's also some resentment that the government still has powers to force ports into privatisation. But those powers have only been used once, and that was 1995. And that indeed, 18 years ago, was the last privatisation in the UK. So it's a process that's perhaps not as sweeping as the impression has been given over the past few years. And in fact, just recently, just before the end of last year, we had an attempt by the Port of Dover to privatise itself, and the scheme was in fact turned down by the government because they said there was not enough community involvement in the forward plan. So I would say that at the moment, if you want to privatise a port, it's quite a difficult job to do it, to fulfil all the different criteria. When people ask me to describe the UK industry, I would describe it as private sector, some of which is privatised. So there is no government involvement in strategy, there is no government money, no government subsidy. Of the three changes I've described with pilotage, dock labour, privatisation, the biggest, in my view, the biggest single change was dock labour, because this meant that ports could really act like normal businesses, if that's a proper expression. Businesses without special conditions attached. And this created the platform for big expansion then in the 1990s. This is an example of a successful port which is private sector but not privatised. And this is Aberdeen in northeast Scotland. This is one of the largest offshore oil supply bases in the world. So it is a trust port. It has no owners. It has a board of trustees. All profits are retained by the port and reinvested in the port. So no return to owners, no special obligations to government, either local or national. Please note the lack of space. I was interested to hear comments about Fremantle and touching trains. If you work in Aberdeen, you're working right in the city. You can see the church there in the background. So the locals are very aware of noise, dust, smell, pollution, you name it. You don't have to have a consultant to tell you what's going on. The locals will tell you what's going on. And that is a big issue for UK. We're a tiny country, quite frankly. Coastal land is extremely expensive and precious. That wonderful thing, natural deep water, that precious thing, is only located in small areas of the country. We have to dredge the rest of it. So we have big issues, very, very intensive, if you like, development of the coast. And just in mentioning Scotland and this image of someone digging Western Australia from away from the rest of Australia, well, Scotland has a referendum on becoming a sovereign state next September. Heaven only knows what it'll do to the British Ports Association if that happens, but that's another political dynamic going on. And ports policy is devolved in Scotland. They do their own thing. They have their own environment laws, their own planning laws. It's devolved in Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland is a complete one-off anyway. And Wales are thinking about devolving there. We have a politically complicated country. So that's a quick tour, and you might think, well, where the hell's all this leading? So I've got some tips. I won't call them I won't dignify them by calling them recommendations. These are just a few tips for you. I've got 6 in total. Take them at your leisure. Basically, governments are bad news for ports. What government should do is get the right planning framework, get the right environmental laws, build roads for you, build rail tracks for you, do all those other public sector things. They've got the muscle to do it. They collect the money, for heaven's sake. They should be able to do those investments. Ports should look after themselves, and that is a basic rule of thumb. And I think I'm so pleased the UK came out reasonably well from some of the studies talked about earlier this morning. That is a thought I'd leave with you with. Privatisation is one way of producing private sector market-driven port. It is not the only way. You don't have to sell off. You can create different structures which describe as private sector with no government involvement, without shareholders, owners breathing down your neck. There are different ways of doing this out there. So don't just think it's either public or privatisation. And back to sort of regular employment. Ports do better if they can employ pilots, dock labour, other specialist skills in the normal way. There is a mystique, or was a mystique, about pilotage. There is a little bit of a mystique about dock labour. Dock labour, quite frankly, is the same as labour in warehouses or in other places. It's the same kind of functions. If it gets out of proportion to the job and to the port, then you've got a few problems. And next, perhaps a little more obvious ones, but ports do make huge contributions to the economy, but they shouldn't get above themselves. We've a little bit planted the idea in the UK recently that ports can make sort of contributions to the local economy, financial contributions to the local economy, do extra things, build things for the local people. They shouldn't really be doing that. If those benefits spin out of what the port is doing, that's absolutely fine, but a port should be about running port business and doing that in the most efficient way, getting more and more out of less and less. And in the environment, ports generally don't do enough about the environment. I moan at my members in the UK, quite unpopular for doing it. Generally, if you look on websites, there's usually a section on the environment and there's a picture of a seagull standing in some mud. And they say, we support the environment or something like that. What I would say to you, if you really are genuine about this, you've got to produce some data. You've got to do some monitoring. You've got to produce indicators of success or otherwise. If the figures are going the wrong way, you've got to be open about it. You've got to publish this data on websites if you can, air quality, water quality, and so forth. We developed some good, simple systems in Europe which you can use to do this. Very happy to share them with you if you would like to do that. And things like carbon footprint. If you just look at your energy bills, you've got to get a good measure of carbon footprint, water usage, waste usage. All these basic indicators are very useful for you. More people, I think, should use them. Not only useful for PR purposes, but you as port operators should know about them as well. And good relationships, well, goes without saying. But as I say, ports should be standalone, but part of that, of course, is working with communities and working with politicians. Of course, you have to. Final point, it's be very interesting. I'm kind of sticking my neck into your particular world. I've only been here since Sunday, so I don't know that much, but I've had experience of this before. In the early 2000s, I was chairman of the European Seaports Organisation, ESPO, and my vice chairman was then the president of the port of Genoa in Italy. And coinciding with the time of my chairmanship was a very controversial piece of legislation that the European Commission were launching. It's to do with, again, with service provision, financial transparency and so forth. And it was quite difficult for ESPO to deal with it because it required ports to basically to do the kinds of things they don't generally like doing, which is giving out more information. But we said, well, it's a fair and reasonable thing. The ESPO position was, you know, we're going to support this piece of legislation and just get on with it and modernise. So this guy said to me, the president, he said, well, look, you know, we're all together on this. You come down to Genoa and we'll do a double act together. We'll talk to all the stakeholders in Genoa. We'll tell them we support this piece of legislation and this is how we want to progress and grow. So I went to a room a little bit like this, packed to the rafters with people, different stakeholders and so forth. So I got up and did my bit and say, well, look, this is a little bit difficult, but we support this progress and reform. And there was a sort of restlessness amongst the audience, I have to say. I hadn't quite captured them, really. There was a muttering going on as I spoke. So I sat down, and then the president got up, and he said exactly the opposite to what I'd said. He tore this thing to shreds and gave against all the agreements that we've ever had. So when we got out, I said to him, you know, what was all that about? You devil, you. And he said, well, all the unions were there, the politicians were there, and all the local government people. He said, I had to give them what they wanted to hear. He said, but don't worry, he said, I'm on your side, really. So you learn a lot about politics from something like that, and we do have to progress, and I think we'll get there. And I have to say, I've been so impressed with what I've seen so far, and the enthusiasm and the commitment. These are difficult things that you're facing up to, and I wish you all the very best in that success. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David Whitehead. So where will the West Australian reform fit into the pattern that David has shared with us and that the earlier speakers have outlined for change around the world? Our next speaker will concentrate on a clearer vision of Gateway's thinking, but basing that argument on the fact that we must change our thinking and that the status quo clearly has not allowed Australian ports in many parts of the coastline to keep up with the change. With more than 30 years of top-level experience in transport and also a good grasp of Western Australia's needs and services, please welcome Steve Lewis, the Chief Executive Officer of the Dampier Port Authority. Thank you, Steve.
Okay, thank you. You can't organise a conference without having the opportunity to talk yourself, so strap in. I'll be in the same place here. Are we seeing the good diagram? Yes, good. Let me just move to that. Obviously, as our chairman Brendan Hammond spoke this morning and outlined the strategic vision we have of how we've been doing our job for the last 4 years or so. And then passing on the baton to me to talk a little bit about the how. And the how is the Gateway thinking, is how you actually do this. But the first thing that I actually wanted to just bring people's attention to, that if you look at that diagram, if you look at those 3 arrows that are there, those arrows are heading towards the future if you're not picking up the way in which that graph's done. But if you look at the smallest arrow, which is the facilitation of trade, that is our role under the Port Authorities Act. If we only thought about the facilitation of trade, and it's a very important thing to think about, that arrow would be smaller in its size. What we've found over the last 4 years is you need to come back to that first big arrow to have any hope of facilitating trade at a good scale. You have to think bigger. And fortunately, being from a Pilbara port, we've been in the think bigger for a lot longer, and Roger would be finding that in his role at Port Hedland. You just cannot think too big for the Pilbara. It's just a fact. It wouldn't matter who was CEO. You just can't be up there without thinking big because you just won't keep up. So it's helped inform the journey that we've been on, is that you have to be thinking about all of the aspects of your port, those intergenerational assets as we talk about, and that creating value, that understanding what's happening outside of your port, to be able to facilitate trade. So I just wanted to make it very clear to people that is one of the important elements of looking at that diagram. And it helps facilitate trade, obviously, at the end of the day, and I'll talk about that shortly. You achieve everything, but you just achieve it in a much, much clearer and better way. Coming back to Gateway thinking, which is at the centre of that diagram, I'm going to break that down. So those 4 headings that are either side of Gateway thinking on that diagram, I'm just going to slip through those. I do apologise for the fact that I'll probably talk a little faster, but just to make sure that I can get all this across to you, but also make sure that we're on track for the rest of our day. Gateway thinking, the dominant port model, and we've heard about it from various speakers already, the dominant port model around Australia and most of the world is the landlord model. It's got an inherent blend of public and private, as we've heard, and etc. And it's very common, but it does suggest that there's a tenant. You know, if you're a landlord, then you've got a tenant. And to me, there's nothing wrong with the model per se, but we've got to, I think, as a port industry, actually stretch ourselves to the fact that if all we're going to do is be a landlord port, then all we're doing is extracting rent. In a fashion. It's a notional rent. We're doing more than that. I'm not denigrating the port industry, but what I'm saying is much more to being a port than just being a landlord. And while it's a useful descriptor of the model, it's certainly, we would never want to see any port being constrained by being a landlord model. So we think that there's real space, and we've been in it for the last 4 years, of actually thinking of ourselves as a gateway. We are custodians of the gateway, whether we like it or not. We are custodians of the gateway on behalf of our owner governments, but particularly on behalf of the people of West Australia and Australia. So we have to then step up to the plate and actually think bigger and broader. And there is a space for thinking bigger and broader. We've been on the journey for a while, and I suppose what I've tried to do with this part of my the diagram is just show how we segment internally our thinking. If you're going to think like a gateway, it's not a choice to just think about it periodically at a strategic planning exercise, think about it every 3 months and see how you're tracking. It has to literally be a daily thing. You have to, every decision you make, and it literally ends up being like that, you have to think about, are we making the decision in the best interest of creating value? Are we making a decision with taking the bigger picture in mind? Because if you do that, then you're more than likely to create value. And so, again, another thing to talk about. In this particular one, the Ports as Gateways segment, which I have as a separate segment, even though the overall theme's Ports as Gateways, the first thing you have to have is expansive thinking. We use the term expansive thinking, or think big, however you want to term it. But you have to be thinking expansively, and the reason for that is because if you're focusing in on a particular item, some decision you might have to make about a land allocation, about a berth, about whether we're going to invest in a certain thing, you have to do it within a context. Sometimes that might be your plan, you've got your land use plan, you've got that published and people know what you're going to do with land, but you've also then got to be able to look and see, well, how is it going to relate to the next 30 or 40 years of the port. And I think one of the things most ports in WA certainly know is that we have to facilitate trade, but not at any cost, which we always remember was always drummed into us from the first day I ever came into the role. And the other thing is you don't have short-term trade at the expense of long-term trade. And that's a much harder thing to pick. How do you actually sort of make an allocation for something that might have a sort of a 10-year life, and then that port land may be gone for the next 40 years or in other ways. So ports have to be really, really very clear about why they're doing things and what they're trying to achieve, and that enables you to do the gateway thinking. So certainly make sure that you're doing expansive thinking, and certainly my team that are here, there's a few smattering of them here today of my leadership team, they know that our biggest mantra is we have to think big. We have to think big, because it's the only way in which you know you're doing things in context. Intergenerational assets for us, you can convert that to talking about creating value. Intergenerational assets, not everybody gets it, but the idea is, as the chairman explained earlier, is that there's a whole lot of assets here that in a lot of cases we're digging up and sending overseas and getting good export dollars for. Back here we should in Australia be seeing those assets being converted into education, into facilities, into other things. Now it's not the port's role per se to make that happen. We're not converting something and then seeing over there we're doing it. But our mentality is that that's what we're seeing happen, and therefore we need to be making sure that we're seeing those opportunities for that, because then we know again we're creating value. And as one of the earlier speakers said, not all value is financial. Some of it is very much social and environmental as well. The other thing in that space is identifying opportunity. You have to continue to keep identifying opportunity. Ports, I think one of the main aspects of ports for me is that they're an information exchange. It's one of the first things that came across to me when I first came into ports 10 years ago, is the information that flows in and out of a port. And it's very useful information, and it should be information that's made available to all the other port users. I mean, some's confidential, obviously we understand commerciality sometimes, but the idea that ports are the free flow of information, we have data, we have information, we've got a sense of what's happening in the community, we've got a sense of what's happening in the hinterland, we've got a sense of what's happening internationally, and we're understanding those supply chains. If we're doing all of that, then we can see opportunity. And then we should be seeing opportunity with the private sector, who can then take up those opportunities. So that's where we come from. The facilitating of trade, I won't labour that, we understand what that is, but that's a very important adjunct. The Port Authorities Act and the role of ports is very clear about that. We are here to facilitate trade, and for very good reason. It's just the context in which we do it is, I suppose, where our paradigm comes from. You need stakeholder alignment. Obviously, sometimes you'll hear ports talk, I know Fremantle sometimes will talk about having the social licence from the community in Fremantle to do things. This stakeholder alignment for us is along similar lines. You have to be, when you're thinking of ports as gateways, you're not in isolation. You need to be making sure that you've got some a reasonable understanding of what's government trying to achieve, what are the community trying to achieve, what is the private sector trying to achieve, and the more dialogue there is, then the better. You have to use your influence and leadership. One of the things we do demonstrate in ports as gateways, ports have a unique position in the value chain. It is quite unique. When you're inside a port, you can see so much of the whole supply chain, a lot of things. We're not saying we live in a perfect world by any means. There's certainly plenty of work to do. But the concept is that we have to be across that. And that's where you see that the ability to then influence and lead is because you lead from a space of having information and having knowledge about where things could go. And sometimes the port's in a perfect position to add value because it can just create a little bit of emphasis, sometimes a bit of impetus for something that someone else has thought about to actually move along. So that's very important. In terms of the other element of this is moving along in creating value. Creating value for us is you hear private sector talk about shareholder value. Obviously here we have a much broader context. And very much this segment of our ports as gateways is for the customer. The first thing there is the customer at the centre. It's very, very easy for any business to start doing business with yourself. If you're going to work and you're actually spending more than 20% of your week in meetings talking about, whether you've got the right IT system and those sort of things, they're all important topics. But that's doing business with yourself. You've got to minimise the amount of that and get back to having the customer at the centre. I'm certainly not saying no one's doing that, but certainly as ports as gateways, you just have to have that. You've got 80% of our time must be spent on what's the customer trying to achieve, and that broad understanding of customer. We prefer customer than stakeholder. Stakeholders, we all know what that means, but it has been done to death over the years. It's nice to get back to just talking about the customer. We think of the customer as port users and also people beyond port users in the community, etc. But obviously with a focus on what needs to come out of the port. A broader view of value. When you start talking about creating value, it's very important that we also don't forget there's other elements of value. The environmental good work that ports do is very important. The heritage work that we do, particularly up in the Pilbara, and making sure that we do understand the sensitivities and the importance of Indigenous heritage is important as well. Information, as I said, is one of the most important things that a port has the carriage of. How that information is catalogued, used, made available, very important. And those relationships. There's a lot of value in relationships. Ports get things done. And they get things done through relationships. I'm a very big advocate of the fact, we know the adage from Hillary Clinton, the fact that you need a village to bring up a child. You need a village to make a really good port as well, without something. You need the community, you need government, you need ports, you need other ports, you need port associations. They all contribute to the fact that the creation of value and in all its many facets. I can't overstress the supply chain insight. Obviously ports are the logistics part of the supply chain, but the more and more that we've started to delve into the various supply chains, and particularly the Pilbara is a great example of a complex and irritable and generally unhelpful supply chain. It's a difficult road for people to do business in, but industry does. And we do it because of having a good insight into it. The port can play a role. But the role we're finding is that we can often help companies to see, even themselves internally, some of the bigger companies may only have 1 or 2 people in the world that can see their whole supply chain. And so therefore they're the same as a lot of us. They're in silos, not by intention, but just the nature of life. Ports, I think, can actually play a really good role in helping to assess that and seeing then how our bit of the logistics chain helps in freeing up value further down the supply chain, outside of the port. So we've certainly been doing some work in that regard and with some good results, I think. The planning and design method, one thing we have noticed is the world's moving very quickly. We all sort of have email, we have Twitter, we have Facebook, all these things. We have young people coming into our workforce that things happen in nanoseconds. You know, people aren't nowadays into the long time frames that some of us might be used to. What we're finding is we have to work with fast design method for things. You just can't take all day. And what we're finding, the good way of doing that is to use customers' own intelligence. The customers are sometimes the best fountain of fast design. They've got good resources, and if you're working together in that collaborative approach, then you can actually get some really good initiatives coming through in quite a fast pace. And some of the things that we've tackled, we've got in and out in 4 months, just in and out of an idea starting and working with a customer, get out 4 months later with that as a done deal. I think that's the sort of thing that ports need to move to. If I come over the other side of the gateway thinking, you've got to start to internalise. I mean, all this might sound good, but obviously internally you've got staff, management. We need to have the internal processes that help back this up. So inside we have a range of things that we do. We've started experimenting with target clusters. And I say experimenting, I mean, we're still on the journey with how all of this stuff's done. But the difference with target clusters, if we've got a problem, we're starting to look at putting a cluster of staff together to actually address that problem. They have a very short time frame to do it and to report back. But the important point I wanted to leave you with clusters, they're not like project teams where you put 4 or 5 people with varying expertise and they all apply their expertise to a problem. We don't do that. What we're doing is we're putting people together to apply their intellect. So if you're the IT guy on the group, we're not expecting you to bring your IT knowledge. Great if it's there, but we're looking for your ideas. And we're finding that that's already starting to show some good promise, where people are starting to come up with ideas that are well outside of their area of expertise. And it's great to have a workforce with the opportunity to get involved in that way. The other one is systems thinking. As probably most of us would know, behaviour follows systems, and it's very important that we've got the right systems in place to support thinking. The one thing that you should get out of my talk is that thinking is really, really important. It sounds like the bleeding obvious, but you have to think, and you have to think in the space all the time to actually achieve results. And so we're altering our systems to more and more encourage that thinking. We already have an internal development application process, what we call an IDA, and that process enables ideas to be floated through the organisation by email, people to give their input, and it's a faster method for us actually to identify those things we're going to take forward. So again, it's trying to think of what those internal things are. The smart port approach for us, we very much got into the space of saying in different issues that we come up with, what would a smart port do? If we've got an issue with it, well, what would a smart port do? What would MacGyver do if you only had a toilet roll and a paper clip? It's that same sort of thinking, what would a smart port do? Why do we ask that? Not because we're, for any other reason than change comes from the current state to a future state. Asking what a smart port would do helps set that future state, which identifies the gap where you are now to where you want to be, and then change comes because you're moving to close that gap. And I can't stress enough how important it is to do that, and also to generate new ideas. The one thing we're sitting down in a smart forum and actually just spending some time saying, well, let's look at what a smart port would do on any particular topic. You pick any topic you like, and all of a sudden you're into a conversation about, well, we know what we do, but what would a smart port do? And it's a very interesting way that ideas come up and how you can actually prosecute those. So what I'm trying to show there with that is that one side of the equation of gateway thinking has to be those internal processes. The port's got to be self-generating in its ideas. But the other side, the external side, helps inform that because we're closer to the customer and we need to get closer again. We're closer to our community and we need to do more of that, and we need to get closer again. We're talking to our major miners, we're understanding their supply chain. All of that together, that gateway thinking, helps you actually get more value out of your port. You actually get you get much more value, and hence then you get investment, and then you get the facilitation of trade. I'd also like to just say that really is the model. I'll just it's just getting down to there. That's I went off the end there. I was going to say I haven't got the final slide there, but really just reminding people, and there's copies of those slides available, is the unique position that ports play in that. Ports are so unique in the value chain, not the supply chain, we're in that as well, but the value chain. How value is created depends very much on the position the port has, and that's why we see ports, and we've been able to do it over the last few years, as a nucleus for many things. We can hear a problem, and often it's a problem that the government might have, and then we can work collaboratively. You know, we're not the be-all end-all of answers, but sometimes we'll have the resources we can apply. We've got people we can put on it. We can take people off something we're doing and put them onto it. Those sort of things are where a port can really step up to the plate. The other thing I'd like to say, in finishing off on that section, is the fact that it hasn't. We're still delivering our results. We're still one of the most profitable ports in West Australia. We're also one of the lowest cost operators. We're also, achieving very well from an environmental point of view. All of our statistics are good. The things that we need to, all our pricing is quite appropriate. And the minister, along with a lot of his ports, would be very happy with the way in which we're producing our results. But we're doing it thinking differently, and we really wanted to make sure that we could present that. I'd just like to finish off very quickly with just saying that from a gateway port point of view, I just wanted to cover some of the characteristics of a gateway port. Some of them you'll recognise if you're in the port industry, but they're all things that we think make up that equation. First of all is the maximising opportunities to create value. Can't stress it enough. Value, financial, environmental, all the different aspects of value, we've got to do it, and you do it through your expansive thinking. You've just got to continue to think big. Ports need to own the underlying seabed and land in their ports. If there's anything out of the landlord model, one of the things you have to have is you have to own the seabed and the land, and I think that's important for government. Government then owns the port in the long term. But ports do not need to be the operator of the port. We're very clear on the fact that there's plenty of room for the private sector to get in and be the operator. There's plenty of room for the private sector to get in and invest in ports. And as we've seen elsewhere, under those sort of lease arrangements and operating arrangements, a lot of good efficiency. We're very keen to see the efficiencies that come from having private sector operation happening in our port, and we're looking for those opportunities for that to happen. But under gateway thinking, that's just par for the course. That's what you would expect to happen. A gateway port owns all the common user infrastructure. I think people would understand that you want to make sure you've got the channel, you've got the navigation aids and some of those other things, because they're all the fundamental structures, the main road into the port. But certainly there's a lot of room there for other things. I think too, ports should focus on the things that ports do best. I don't think operations, we're all pretty good operators and as ports, but I think there's always room for the private sector in that, and we keep coming back to that. But ports' role is to make sure there's sufficient land and water and power and expansion and the planning, etc. So there's a lot of work for ports to do to make sure we're setting the frame for that. So again, a gateway port does that. Gateway ports also play a central role in assisting the private sector to fund port expansion. As the Minister said, ports need to be in shape. We need to be getting the sort of returns that would be attractive to the private sector, so that they might be also attracted to getting into that sort of industry. And I think how we actually go about that, we have the best knowledge of the revenue potential in our port, we have the best knowledge of future trade. We should have. It's our day-to-day business, and so therefore we can help the private sector there. I think gateway ports promote the free flow of information, and certainly any data that we get in our port from either drilling or dredging material, all of the hydrographic stuff, try to make it as freely available as we're able to, depending on how it's come to us, because that's what a port should do. A plan beyond the port boundaries. It's no good if a port just plans within its port boundaries. Obviously, from a legal point of view, we only have the land within our port boundaries and our waters, but to do good planning, you've got to have an inner port, outer port and beyond port approach. If you're not planning beyond the port, then you're certainly not going to be able to get those access arrangements and that. So a gateway port does that. Gateway ports, under a commercialised structure, also are a conduit between industry and government. One of the beauties that ports have is we speak both languages. You know, we're fully commercialised entities, so we speak the private sector language very, very, very well, and we can do some very, very good contract negotiations, etc. And we understand what the private sector is trying to achieve. But we also speak the language of government, so we can actually assist the private sector to actually get its approvals and to understand the steps it has to go through. And ports play a very important role in that, I think. Gateway ports are part of the community, and they need to be part of the community. I think without exception, all ports are connected to a community in some way or another, and it's great to be part of a community, and ports can do more in that space. Certainly we can, and we do. Gateway ports take overall responsibility for the environment. The Port Authorities Act in West Australia does provide that role for the ports, even over and above the EPA's own role in the state. The ports also have to make sure we have a good environment as well, and we're very comfortable with how that's done within industry. But Gateway Port does that. Why? Because it's important, but also it's creating value. It's creating value for the community to have a really well-placed environment and heritage. Gateway ports also must have flexible, nimble organisation structures and clear accountabilities, and it's something we've spent quite a bit of time on ourselves. You want competent, knowledgeable, thinking people. And I'm very pleased with the team that we've been able to amass at the Dampier Port Authority in that regard. We've got some really competent people doing some great work and thinking outside the square on a daily basis. And that doesn't always yield results, but God, you'd never want to dampen the enthusiasm for those things, because that's where ports create value. And gateway ports have strong corporate governance practices. We are corporations, and we're commercialised, but there's a very strong need for us to actually make sure we have strong integrity, honesty, fair play, etc. So if you're dealing with a gateway port, then you know you're dealing with an honest broker, and so very important to us. So to conclude, I'd just like to say, if you do not think as a gateway on a daily basis, you cannot realise the potential value of being a gateway. We've been on this journey for a while. It's not something that people just pick up and, you know, you're a gateway port tomorrow. And some of the ports here will recognise elements of this that they already do, and that's great. What we're saying is a journey worth taking, because to facilitate trade in this state, you've got to be thinking big, you've got to be thinking about intergenerational assets, you've got to be thinking about sustainability, you've got to be thinking about the future. Thinking like a gateway, being the custodian of a gateway, and having performance assessed as a gateway is the exciting future for the DPA, and we're very happy to be thinking this way. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve, and to Australian Maritime Services, one of your sponsors here today. Could I invite back to join us now for some discussion Brendan Hammond, Rhys Waldock and David Whitehead to come back up to the stage, please, David. And Steve, while our colleagues join us, maybe we could open with you. Anyone who has a question, it will help us if you could make your way to these microphones and catch my eye. Steve, while we wait, can I put to you, as someone working in the Northwest, an issue that was raised this morning about whether we have in Australia the innovation and whether we have looked far enough ahead to the kind of size and nature of the shipping that is headed our way. Dr. Ashaf spoke of this other generation that's coming down the pipeline. So to begin, do you think in those northern ports already we have really looked far enough into the future to see what is coming our way?
Thanks,
I certainly think ports like Port Hedland particularly, I think, would be, and I'm sure Roger would back me up there, have certainly got a good awareness of the size, Cape-size vessels they could be getting into the airport and how they might handle them. I suppose on our side we've got certain already existing constraints in terms of what large vessels can get in. So the interesting thing this morning was when you start talking about liner services and the size in which container ships may get to. At the moment in the Pilbara, that's not trade that comes to us, but we're certainly doing some work on how that might come to us and how we might be able to facilitate that growth. So early days for us, we'd probably be only in that conversation for the last 3 months or so, but again, in thinking big, We thought we were thinking big, and then these things come up a few months ago. We've already started to think about how we can actually get our port in shape for those sort of things. But it'll be a gradual thing as to how it actually occurs. But we've got some interesting ideas which have come through from the exercise that we're doing about how we might change the game somewhat. So the short answer is yes, but it's more work to be done.
Please join in this discussion if you have questions of someone this morning. Yes, come up to the microphone if you could.
Yeah, thank you. Malcolm Tull for David Whitehead. Thank you very much for your informative talk on the British experience. A couple of questions. One is, I got the impression that the European Ports Coordination or Council has been, well, spectacularly unsuccessful. I just wonder if you could elaborate on the reasons for that. And the second one, I suppose, is a bit of perhaps a speculative one, and that is that in view of the referendum that's like to take place in the UK on European Union membership, what are the implications for the ports if Britain does exit the EU? Does it mean, for example, that the blue banana will shrink southwards? Thank you.
I'll take the second one first. A, we will never pull out of the EU. You've heard it here first. B, if we did, well, I think it would affect trade. It wouldn't affect the way in which our ports are constructed and the ports policy regime. But I think we would suffer from a fall down trade. And yes, the famous blue banana could shrink down a little bit, much to the delight of Italy, probably, who I've maligned a little bit this morning. But yes, it would change. Sorry, the first question was, I didn't quite understand. You're talking about the way in which EU ports coordinate together, was that correct?
Yes, or the lack of that, I gathered from your comment, yes.
Well, yes, that's a good question. I think that the basic division within EU ports, they do come together, they do frequently meet together and discuss these things. I think the big issue for them is the extent of reform and their commitment to that reform. And that reform is a very painful process. But you've got to remember, just stepping back a little bit from the details of that, you're talking about, I think, is it 26 member states all agreeing on the same progress with reforms, all speaking different languages, different types of countries. So that's a huge task. But if you're interested in EU policy, there is a very significant regulation going to be launched at the end of May. And that will really make big changes into the way in which service contracts are awarded. So it should produce a kind of uniformity into the way big service contracts are awarded, allow service providers to come into the market. It will provide a bit more uniformity on the way in which subsidy is used and the way in which subsidy is accounted for. So yes, it's a painful process. It marches slowly. And so without going on, I think that the general view of ports is that they are not a huge political problem for the Commission, but there are some positive things that can be done.
Brendan, while we wait for the next question, clearly aligning strategic planning with the uncertainty about investment goes to issues like China's economic future. And just in the media this week, the reporting that inside China they're being urged yet again to consider quite dramatic changes to impact on China's planning. So how can we here in Australia, where clearly the northwest is very aligned, with that degree of uncertainty, how can we align investment and give investors the degree of certainty they want to build even better and more efficient ports?
Jeff, I think part of the answer is in looking a long way beyond the current cycles and the current bases of wealth generation in places like the Pilbara. And not being at all philosophical, but being very practical, when one considers the resources, the mineral resources and the oil and gas resources that we have as a nation in this part of the world as endowment assets, then it is incumbent upon us to be building the value of those assets into the future and ensuring that we build and preserve that value inside Australia and inside Western Australia. Now, all of that may sound a little bit philosophical and ephemeral, but it's hard fact, because if every lump of iron ore, if every molecule of gas and oil that departs these shores departs never to return with very little remaining on shore, then we have no answer except when China goes down and the holes are all dug and the wells are all dry. Well, gee, not quite sure what we're going to do, go back to, you know, the cattle in the scrub. However, through the gateway model that we're progressing, we do look a long way into the future, and we do look post-China. For instance, one of the fascinating, I really enjoyed Dr. Ahab's conversation this morning about the trade routes, because we do routinely at a board level in the DPA look at the Indian Ocean Basin as that's our pond. Now, China looks at the Pacific as that's their pond, and that's great. We look at the Indian Ocean Basin, that is our pond, and we take a very, very long, over the horizon, 50, 100-year view of what might this thing look like. And thus, when the news comes out that China is busy building rail and pipeline links down through Myanmar to get direct access out of China to the Indian Ocean, one realises, gee, why is China doing that? Well, China's doing that because currently all of its trade does go through the ship-constrained Malacca Straits under the watchful eye of the US 7th Fleet. I'm not sure that the Chinese like that very much. But here's a thought. Why not have vessels that are unconstrained by the Malacca Straits and that post-iron ore land in at Headland and Karratha, and using the heavy rail that we have, plus extensions across to the east coast, have those rail trucks that you were talking about that roll off the ships, hitched to locomotives, straight across Australia and out the other side, and we're eating Singapore's lunch. Now, that may sound like a very big dream, but I believe it is in that sort of thinking, whether that turn into reality or otherwise, that the future lies beyond the fortunes of China going up and down. And that is how we're able to use the endowment assets of our mineral resources to build an economy into the future, and not to wind up in a place where the resources are gone and we're all looking at ourselves. Well, we won't be there because we will all in this room have fallen off our perches by then. But our children and great-grandchildren will look around and say, gee, what's next?
Thank you. So,
Great to hear, Brendan. Economic diversification, certainly. Ken King, I'm CEO of the Pilbara Development Commission. I'd just like to commend all the presenters today for their presentations, but I guess my interests are very much with the Pilbara. And Steve, that was a great presentation you gave. My comment or question is regarding social impacts. You mentioned thinking inner, outer and beyond the port and into the community. And I guess in many instances that's about revitalisation around the port, around the space around the port, involving yourselves in the community, and sometimes there are conflicts there. How best we can deal with those conflicts, and where you align yourself with all your customers, and some of your customers being obviously the community around your port, and how you manage sometimes that conflict between the industry that you're serving and the community that you're part of.
Yeah, thanks, Ken. Yeah, I think Dampier is quite an interesting port in the sense that it was a town built by industry, obviously back in the very early 60s. So the town of Dampier itself is very used to cohabitating with at least the iron ore side of the port. Obviously in the 80s when the North West Shelf came along, the port expanded, and obviously the town of Karratha has come out of that, and so we have a thriving community, very much aware of the fact that it's a resource-based community, but certainly moving towards a Pilbara city structure and some very strong aspirations to be much more. I think from a port point of view, partly it's been making sure that we're in the right forums and that we've got an awareness of that. As I say, I still think ports are a great information exchange, and being able to see what the community's feeling about those things. I'd have to say the Port of Karratha Dampier, the town, are very supportive of the port and vice versa, which is good. But I would, I suppose, typify our approach is that in some things that come to our attention, we're able to lead. A port can legitimately lead some change. Sometimes we will lead from the side. In other words, we'll actually encourage somebody else and we'll lead from the side and lend our either expertise or sometimes some funding, those types of things. And other times we'll cheer from the side, because ports can add their influence and weight to something that someone's doing in the community without us necessarily being involved. I hope people understand what I'm saying there. The port has a clear role in its own, making sure that we've got an efficient running port. That's the base from which everything we talk about occurs. But our role in the community is to keep in touch, to make sure we know what the community is looking for, and that we know that some agency in the Pilbara is acting on that, and where can the port help. And as I say, sometimes we can help directly, sometimes we can help in our support, and sometimes we can help in just cheering and applauding the fact that it's happening. But it's certainly, that would be my view of how we approach it.
Thank you, Steve. To round this out, Rhys Waldock, the point David Whitehead made was that government, in his view, should do as little as possible to actually be involved in the operation. And he gave us the scenario that there are many degrees of privatisation, and the Minister himself said private capital investment in various aspects can be a very healthy thing, although we are looking at ports that belong at the moment within this operation of government. So can you envisage, sitting inside the system, things we haven't yet discussed where privatisation or private capital investment could let us in the West do this better?
Thank you, Jeff, and I'll round this out nicely, I hope. We've already mentioned that we are embracing private sector involvement wherever possible. That's without question. I'm mindful of what David said, and David's first tip was privatise, privatise, privatise. I would just make a few points there, and I'm not just peddling the government's policy, I'm actually arguing perhaps for wider consideration. Firstly, David talked about it, and it's a competitive market. There are many ports that can compete in England, and I guess you could even argue that in Australia, the East Coast ports, the ones that are privatised, are still competing. Brendan was the first to suggest, right up front, that we have natural monopolies in Western Australia, and natural monopolies they are. So when we're considering this, just let's think through some of those issues. I think the other issue, of course, we say, well, privatise. Well, I think I was a player in Port Hedland, and if you are, and so there's private and private, and we talked about either miners taking over Port Hedland as a private capacity, or even an infrastructure provider taking over from what the Port Authority does now. I would suggest that BHP and FMG would be extraordinarily nervous, and part of that reason is what I said earlier. It's about access and pricing, and unless we've got the best of the best economic regulators, I don't think we have. I think it's always tough, and if you don't believe me, just sort of see how difficult it's been getting access to rail lines in Pilbara for the last 10 years, 15, 20 years. Finally, I'll just finish off by suggesting, if we think privatising of ports is always great, it's the panacea for all our problems, then I'll ask you to think of a port which we all know very well, and it's Perth Airport. Thank you.
Would you please thank all of our speakers? And we're going to lunch thanks to another one of our sponsors, Clayton Utz, and we'll try and be back promptly if we can in about half an hour's time. Thank you all.